At the Global Liver Institute, we believe it all starts with a patient. So what happens when a patient, a liver patient no less, one of the 500 million people living with conditions that often go undiagnosed, untreated, or misdiagnosed, mistreated, and stigmatized, brings the challenges of liver patients front and center? And what happens when a patient then leads a discussion with world experts in policy, research, clinical care, and wellness on ways to overcome these challenges? Let's find out today on GLI Live. Hello and welcome. My name is Donna Cryer. I am the CEO of the Global Liver Institute, lovingly known as GLI. And today we will be talking about COVID-19 updates, booster shots, and what do immunocompromised people like myself, including liver transplant recipients, cancer patients, what do we need to know about navigating COVID today? For that, I have the perfect guest. Dr. Robert Fontana has been the co-chair of the FAASLD COVID task force. Welcome, Dr. Fontana.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
We are so excited. There are so many questions that transplant recipients, cancer patients, and those who are immunocompromised for a variety of factors have about COVID. What is different about us when we think about the virus itself potentially becoming infected and COVID vaccines? What is different about it?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's a broad group of people, but I think first off, it's more common than not. Like when I've been writing part of our guidance documents, I hadn't realized as a doctor that something like 3% of the entire adult population is considered immunocompromised. I think it's a lot more. It's not 1 in a million. It's 3%. Right. And as you said, immunocompromised is someone who's on chronic immunosuppressive drugs like transplant recipients or someone who's on steroids, Imuran, those kinds of drugs. Or if you have cancer or other medical diseases that affect your immune system. And the reason we sort of parse that out and all these guidelines talk about the immunocompromised and the recommendations get a little bit more complex for COVID, it's because we know with COVID as well as other infections that if you're immunocompromised and you acquire the infection, you're going to have a harder time clearing it and get into more complications. So for example, with COVID, if you're a transplant recipient or anyone who's immunocompromised, you're more likely to get sick, show up in the ER, and then get hospitalized. So this is a particular subgroup, and it's a large subgroup, 3% of the whole population, that we're particularly worried about. And then if you get hospitalized, we're particularly worried because more adverse outcomes happen in immunocompromised people. So we're particularly targeting immunocompromised individuals to avoid infection through vaccination and social distancing and masking and so on. And then in terms of vaccination, despite this is one of the highest risk groups of people to suffer the consequences, the responses are also lower. So we have high risk and lower efficacy. So we're particularly worried, which is why there's been more research about getting a third dose of the COVID vaccine into transplant patients, for example, ahead of all the other people in the general population. And I think it makes good medical sense from where I sit.
We've definitely partnered with FAASLD and the other medical societies in helping to get that information across to policymakers at the state levels and local levels, as well as the federal level, to ensure that patients were prioritized appropriately. And so I really thank you for the evidence that could be the foundation for that advocacy. I wanted to just clarify a point for our audience, because often people conflate being immunocompromised with having no immune system. It doesn't mean that we have a fundamental immune deficiency. We do have an immune response. It's just less than other people, or what it would be otherwise if we weren't on the medications, or if our condition wasn't compromising it, which is, was the term. And so is that true? We do have still
Right.
have an immune system. It's just not working quite as robustly.
Absolutely. It's all about relative risk, I think, is what you're getting at. So someone who's immunocompromised is relatively increased risk for hospitalization and so on, but it's not all or none. You can be immunocompetent and still get COVID and end up quite sick in the intensive care unit. And then amongst individuals who are immunocompromised, we medically think of mild, moderate, and severe also within the immunocompromised bucket. So so you're right, it's a relative thing. And there's been lots of microbes in our environment for hundreds of thousands of years that we all handle, whether you're immunocompromised or immunocompetent. It's just that COVID is such a stealth infection to get in through the the nasopharynx and rapidly get into the lungs that it plays out so quickly. That's why we're particularly worried about COVID and immunocompromised patients.
So for people who are hesitant to take the vaccine, what are the long-term effects of COVID? And so what are we really comparing? Any potential very low potential for side effects or brief transient adverse reactions to the vaccine versus the known adverse effects of contracting COVID, and the long-term effects that perhaps we don't even know how we are seeing long-term effects, and we don't know how extensive those would be. So help people understand the relative risks involved in vaccinations versus risking contracting COVID.
So I'm very much a numbers person who likes to be able to explain this to my patients. So in terms of the risk of the vaccine, they're very low risk of serious consequences, somewhere between 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million. So put that in one hand, which is a low risk, right? On the other hand, if you're overall in the general population with COVID infection, if you're an adult, it's about a 1 to 3% risk of getting hospitalized if you get primary COVID infection. And if you're immunocompromised, it can go up as high as 20%. So you've got a 20% risk of a serious consequence of the viral infection, and a 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million of a serious problem for the vaccine. So you just weigh that, and the scale tips pretty quickly, in my mind, that vaccine is definitely the way to go. And then you can avoid all the is it going to be me? Because we cannot tell on an individual patient basis who's going to end up in that 20% with serious outcomes. So since we don't have it, we have a very safe set of vaccines. There's 3 of them. We are really kind of pushing the vaccine to prevent it, and also prevent transmission, because if you get vaccinated, then you don't get the infection, and et cetera. So the reservoir, if you will, of unvaccinated people, as that goes down, the whole pandemic should slowly dampen down, but it's all slower than we all wish it. We wish it could be faster. So,
well, we need everybody. This is sort of a participatory activity. We need everybody to step forward. And I also say that it's very important that, I would wear, I still have it, but I would wear a pin that says, your vaccination protects me. And so while I was sort of waiting in the queue to be eligible for a vaccination, it was so important to communicate that other people getting vaccinated was also, an act of love and an act of community, because it was protecting me and other people who couldn't yet take the vaccine. And I think that's, still true, as there are gaps in, waning immunity and things like that, or just persistent, immunocompromised status, that other people's vaccination are also protecting me, not just my own vaccination.
Absolutely. So you get the personal self-benefit, you get the satisfaction of helping others in the general population, and probably more close to home is your family members, right? Right. So that if you don't get it and then they don't get it,
Mm-hmm.
They're healthier, you're healthier, et cetera. So there's sort of like, concentric circles, right, of the worlds we all live in, right? Our families, our work, our local community, and then, the state or county we live in, and then the whole country. And since the whole country has been on fire with COVID, the bells are ringing. We all need to do something. We all, like you said, we all have a role here in public health, which is if we are to all get vaccinated and reduce the number of unvaccinated people, again, the fire will dampen down faster if we're all in this together. And I think that's a good point to make, not just personal benefit, but national benefit, if you will.
I think that's so important. That's why it's called public health.
Right.
Because the public needs to participate in it. So transplant recipients and that 3% of adults who have some form, many diverse forms of immunosuppression, have been approved for a third and now a fourth dose of the COVID vaccine. Why do we need it, and how did researchers and regulators come to that decision?
Yeah, so good question. So in terms of why the third dose for just the immunocompromised in transplant patients, there's two reasons for that. The first is that the primary response to the vaccine itself, the efficacy, if you will, of the 2 shots of the mRNA vaccine or the 1 shot of the J&J is lower in immunosuppressed people. And I'm not surprised by that, because pretty much every vaccine that I give, it's always a lower response in immunosuppressed patients, because they just can't develop as strong of an immune response. Like you say, it's not a 0, it's just not as strong. So we have that fact. And we've actually seen that, for example, indirect evidence, for example, the ability to generate a circulating antibody in the blood. But more importantly, that when exposed to COVID, transplant patients and so on who've been vaccinated are more likely to get what we call breakthrough infection. And in fact, right now in this 4th wave of COVID in the United States and in my own hospital here, there's more people who either were never vaccinated or are immunocompromised and then getting breakthrough infection. So because of those observations, lower immune response, more clinical infections, if you will, despite the 2 doses of vaccine, the FDA and the CDC and all the government agencies were closely tracking this. And fortunately, we have 2 other countries that are a bellwether for us that are further along, and that's Israel and the UK. And they were seeing the same thing about a month or 2 before we did. And they were sort of very progressive with pushing the 3rd dose out to the high-risk groups, and it worked. And so we have data to show that if you get that 3rd dose, if you're one of the immunocompromised people, you will then start to, again, get on top of it. So I think it makes, from medical scientific perspective, makes totally good sense to me, although it's confusing because the way this kind of trickles out in the media and news, it's very sensationalistic, shall we say, of the way that it's played out. And you have to understand that normally with vaccine development for, chicken pox and influenza and so on, those clinical trial programs are usually carried out over 8 or 9 years.
Right.
They have all this time to accrue this data and know exactly what to expect. Here, we all know that, COVID is a very young disease. I mean, a year and a half. And so we've had to kind of accelerate all the decision-making, different dosing and age groups and so on in a highly compressed time, which is why everyone feels so pressured, because there's a lot at stake.
Absolutely. But there are, it's interesting when you watch documentaries and some really wonderful news pieces on how many years back this mRNA research goes, some of the testing of the building blocks and pieces that went into the vaccination and the supply chain to deliver the vaccines was all in process. And so while the putting together of it was done miraculously quickly. And we're still looking at, trial data of different studies, coming out. It didn't just sort of start in, January 2 years ago. There were parts of this that have been going on for years.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the pleasure of doing a webinar about a year ago with Dr. Weissman from University of Pennsylvania, who's one of the pioneers in mRNA technology. And he's been working on this since the early 90s. And we've known how to synthesize mRNA vaccines for several decades. It just, again, was the slow, methodical grind of biomedical research. And we were, in a way, very fortunate here in the United States that we had this, these experts in different universities and industry and the government, and they got the sequence of the virus very quickly. They then made it in the lab on the mRNA, and lo and behold, it started working within the phase 1 and phase 2 studies. So you're right that the technology has been around a while. It was the rapid uptake of it. And I can tell you, as a physician, there are very few vaccines that I give that are this effective and safe. I mean, to have a vaccine that works in 95, 96, 98% of people, that's unheard of. I mean, like the flu shot, which I've been getting for the last 25 years, it only works in about 30 to 40%. And how many millions of people, and I'm strongly encouraging the flu shot. But actually that brings up another point, which is this technology is so good and so specific that several companies are now looking to, come up with flu shots that are based upon the same technology. And probably, I imagine, the next year or two, we might be seeing the traditional clinical trials on those. So really is a game changer, and it's very fortunate that we have the technology, if you will, on the shelf, pulled it out, and we're able to ramp up quickly.
That's fantastic. While we're on flu, we had talked about this a little bit before the show, and many people ask, should they be getting their flu shot in addition to their, third shot for COVID? What is the answer?
Yeah, so that's an important point because it's flu season now in Michigan, as it is, I'm sure, in DC. So it is recommended by the CDC that non-COVID shots should continue to be given per standard of care. So, and it's okay to get the COVID shot, the first, second, or third dose, and the flu shot on the same day, just different arms. Because you will get a little bit of pain and a little bit of swelling at the local reaction, if you will. So it'd be better to do one in one arm and one in the other arm, but there's no reason not to. And in fact, I was just in clinic this morning and I did that. 2 of my patients got double vaccines, the flu shot and the COVID shot. So it's recommended. And this is particularly important also for kids, as you know. Kids, before they get to kindergarten, I think there's a total of 15 vaccines required in most states. Yeah, it's a lot. And so that's a lot of vaccines for our children to get. And there's no reason not to. Granted, there is no COVID shot approved under the age of 5 till yesterday. The vaccine just got approved, the 6 to 11-year-olds. But the 6 to 11-year-olds are also getting concomitant non-COVID vaccines. So yes, important point. No reason not to get the flu shot. A lot of my patients also ask about the shingles shot, right, to prevent zoster reactivation. Same thing. It's okay to take them on the same day if it's more convenient, or out and about at the doctor or the pharmacy or what have you.
I think that's important to, because I still am sort of limiting my trips outside the bubble for the most part, unnecessarily. So I have gotten both my flu shot and my third COVID shot. But that's a really important point. Even people who were willing or interested in getting their flu shot, they were wondering if they could combine them, for efficiency, and because, the trouble of making it out, let alone bringing out husband and kids and other family members, and coordinating those visits to be able to do them both, perhaps at a local CVS or your doctor's office. I think would really ensure that as people are starting to expand their circle, perhaps planning to meet with family for Thanksgiving, having more
Good
social
point.
gatherings or unmasked. The rate of flu, which was down last year because everybody was masked and socially distant, is expected to rise this year with some, reopening. And so for people to be protected against both, I think is important.
I would fully agree with that. And again, medically, we cannot tell the difference between new onset influenza and new onset COVID infection. So again, I would rather have all my patients get both shots to prevent both, because you just cannot tell symptoms of runny nose, fever. They're very non-specific, and we want to prevent both illnesses.
Absolutely. And we want to keep people working if they're back at work. We want to keep kids back at school, and everybody needs to get out of the house.
A little cabin fever, and it's only early November. So. and
stay safely out. I know certainly before I went to the American College of Gastroenterology meeting, I was like, what can I take? I want you to take everything before I venture on,
you
like,
traveled.
my first flight in 2 years, and rediscover how to do airport. And so I did test 5 days after I came back, just to make sure I didn't bring anything back to anybody in my household. And I seem to have traveled safely and successfully. But I did want to make sure that for me and for everybody I would interact with afterwards, that I had done everything possible and gotten all my vaccinations.
Good. You see, you've shown everyone you can do it, right? You can fly, you can thrive and survive, and that's what we all need to do, because I think the empowerment that the vaccine will help you. Now, it's not 100% protective, and I think that's an important point.
I wore my mask on the plane, and while I was out, I got one in that matched. So you can make a fashion statement.
Yeah.
Other questions that we get from patients, and I think people are always just searching for ways to be well, and you can't fault them for that. And there's a lot of misinformation abound, and there's a lot of talk about natural remedies and supplements, and vitamin D and zinc to veterinary medicines, which I will not name. But would you like to talk about sort of debunk some of the myths and misinformation in that area, and particularly talk about, how harmful it be for people who have an impaired liver to start to walk down that path, since you are an expert in drug-induced liver injury?
Sure. So I have the pleasure on my weekends to thumb through the 180-page NIH consensus guideline on how to treat COVID. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of doing that, I just brushed up on the latest version yesterday, so I was prepared for today. So I actually recommend, for anyone who's interested, it's available through the NIH website. It can download it. They update it every couple days, actually. But if you read that, which I think is the most authoritative, if you will, on treatments for COVID, and there have been some studies with vitamin C and also with zinc, and a few with vitamin D. And none of them have proven to be effective. Now, does that mean that vitamin C or vitamin D or zinc are not good for you? No, it doesn't mean that. But if you think that you're going to get better with, diagnosed COVID at home by taking vitamin C and vitamin D and zinc, there's no evidence to support that. Certainly, I advise avoiding herbal products in general, particularly for a transplant patient, because some herbals can cause drug-drug interactions with the immunosuppressants and create untoward problems. So we'd like to have something that's simple, if you will, that natural, if you will, but it doesn't exist. So we have to go through the traditional clinical trial model of a randomized study and follow people out. And those studies are being done. And as you know, there is a prescription pharmaceutical, hopefully coming maybe by the end of the year. It's hard to know when it'll get approved from Merck, called molnupiravir. That looks quite good. The clinical trial data showed that a 5-day course reduced the rate of hospitalization and death by over 50%. It was quite remarkable.
Wow.
So this could be a game changer prescription drug. And the details as to how you would access it and where can you get it, and because in the study that they did, you have to get it within, I believe it was 10 days of the initial symptoms. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge on the uptake side of how to get it into people's hands, and then you need a doctor's prescription and so on and so forth. But that's coming. So, but for now, I certainly tell all my patients who are diagnosed with COVID, quarantining at home first and foremost. If you're not, having severe shortness of breath or chest pain, lots of fluids, right? Analgesics are okay. I get asked that a lot. Can I take Tylenol? I've had a liver transplant, and the answer is yes. Tylenol's safe to take as long as you watch the total dose, keep it under 2,000 milligrams or 2 grams, which is the equivalent of 4 or 5 extra strength or 6 regular strength in a 24-hour period. If your analgesic of choice is more like Motrin or ibuprofen, that's okay too. It's not going to make COVID worse. Fluids, whatever your fluid of choice is, obviously not alcohol, because you can get a little liver damage signal from COVID infection itself, and it can kind of confuse the picture. But other than that, there really isn't any role that's medically recommended at this point for these over-the-counter things to make you get better quicker from outpatient COVID.
That's really helpful. What about other, treatments, and it's unclear, I think, to a lot of people of where they might come in. And I know there's no substitute for being vaccinated in the first place so that you don't contract COVID, but plasma or remdesivir or other things like that. Where do they fit in?
Yeah. So again, it's sort of like a stepwise approach. So right now, the standard of care is just bed rest, quarantining, and time. The drug that we talked about, molnupiravir, we hope will be approved by the end of the year, but it's not available yet. So really, for outpatients, that's what we have. In addition, we do, however, have monoclonal antibodies for outpatients. So those are drugs that are very targeted to inhibit the virus from replicating in the body. The challenge with this class of drugs is delivering it to the patient, because right now there's 3 formulations of Regeneron, Lilly, and a third one. It has to be given by an IV infusion. So think about that. You have to then go to a facility, a medical facility that has got everyone with N95 and the PPE and the rooms and the sterility and so on. So it's a challenge. The government has been very helpful here. They provide the monoclonal antibody at no cost, but you still have to go to a facility to get it, and someone drives you, etc. They're working on a subcutaneous version of these to be able to take and pick up and then take it at your home, but there's still research. So that's only recommended for outpatients, and the type of outpatients that I've given that to is, again, my transplant patients, immunocompromised individuals, individuals who have diabetes, individuals with obesity, anyone on an immunosuppressant of any kind. Those are the people who have COVID, because if you have COVID and you have those risk factors, your risk of getting hospitalized, like we talked about earlier, is higher. The monoclonal antibodies reduce your likelihood of needing hospitalization. So we want to give that. It's just a little bit cumbersome right now, but strongly recommended. I think, over 500,000 doses have already been given out in the United States. So it's pretty prevalent. And if you're interested, there's a lot of people here from around the country. You can go to your state website, your state public health department, and they can show you on a map, this place has it and that kind of thing. So most county health departments can direct you, or the state health department.
I think that's fantastic, and we'll put those in the show notes along with the guidelines. one of the questions that we get, and this may be one of the last questions for today, is, can patients take a test to see if they've responded to the vaccine, or how well, and give them a guide to the sort of a personalized risk? Is a test with that level of precision available yet?
Yeah, we all are looking for it, and it's not available yet. And so the FDA and the CDC do not recommend getting one of the currently EUA approved blood tests. The blood tests measure antibodies to what we call the spike glycoprotein, or the S protein of the virus. There's another set of antibodies that measure antibodies to the nucleocapsid protein. So the way those work is, if you had primary COVID infection, you'll have antibodies to the nucleocapsid and to the spike glycoprotein. Whereas if you just get vaccinated, you didn't get the infection, you should only get an antibody to the spike glycoprotein. So you could theoretically do that. But the problem, as you said, is they've not been validated for interpretation purposes. So they're working on it as we speak, but they don't have it. And these tests need a certain, what we call signal to noise cutoff, like what's the threshold for a positive antibody or not. And the other problem is that those tests that you measure in the blood, they're not necessarily a perfect or a very accurate correlate of immunity, which is really what you're asking for. What's the correlate of immunity? If I got my 3 doses of the COVID vaccine, am I okay now? Can you tell me that? I want to know. And the answer is, we don't know. We don't have those tests. We're working on them. There's some more sophisticated assays that look at your T cell and your B cell response. I can tell you those are going to be slower to come to the market because they're more sophisticated to do in the lab. So we're working on those. Those are being done in the clinical trials of new vaccines and new antivirals. But bottom line is, we don't have that level of accurate and precise blood test to guide us in our confidence levels.
Dr. Fontana, thank you so much. And for people who want to hear more information like this, and more information on many of the latest research and cutting edge discussions that affect people with liver disease and liver transplant, I think the best place may be the upcoming digital liver meeting. And so you'll be there, right? I'll be there.
I'll be there virtually. It was supposed to be in Anaheim, California, that I was really looking forward to, but I'll be here in Ann Arbor, Michigan for it.
I'll be beaming in from Washington, D.C., but they're increasingly, I've had the privilege of serving on the Patient Advisory Committee since its inception, and I'm really excited, and I want to thank AASLD for the number of patient-focused and patient-led activities throughout the meeting. And so we'll absolutely put the link to that in the show notes as well. And I would encourage patients and patient advocates, to consider some of this content to better understand your own experience or your loved one's experience with liver disease, or to think about how to take the next step in advocacy. So
yeah, I strongly second that. We're all ambassadors here, right? Ambassadors of up-to-date and accurate information. And like I said, it's a bit overwhelming, the speed. It's a fire hose of news every day of 10 and 20 reports, and it's hard to distill it and say, well, what's the bottom line here? And that's the nice thing about these kinds of forums, and just like what we're doing here, of getting the latest, hopefully clear messaging on what is it saying. As you said, zinc and vitamin D, there's been studies, but they're not proven. They're not going to be effective. The vaccine dosing, it's a little bit complicated, right? If you're a transplant patient, we're recommending 3 doses now of the mRNA vaccine, and that 3rd dose should be at least 28 days after your 2nd dose. But then boosters are different for people who aren't necessarily immunocompromised, but yet got vaccinated more than 6 months ago. So it's a little bit of a complicated matrix to navigate, as you said. And, and I think the AASLD and other patient-facing organizations do a great job. And the more we can all educate each other and keep up, and also reassure ourselves, right, that we are getting out of this. We're getting out of this. The clouds are starting to slowly fade away. Hopefully there's not another thunderstorm of a fifth wave, but we'll be better prepared for it, right? And more knowledgeable, and more drugs and diagnostics in our back pocket to draw on. And we do better and better each and every day.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for ensuring that we do better and better every day. And I'm so grateful. I know GLI is grateful to be working with you. So thank you for today's conversation. And to our viewers, until next time.
Please be sure to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Join us weekly on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time for more episodes of GLI Live. Check out our website, globalliver.org, and follow us on social media to learn more about the Global Liver Institute and stay up to date with the latest in liver health. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and stay connected.